Well, Dodge Billingsley is a fellow here at the David M. Kennedy Center for International Studies and is also the director of combat films and research and a senior faculty member at the Naval Postgraduate School's Center for Civil Military Relations. He's been a longtime observer of many wars and contested regions and has spent a considerable amount of time with U.S. and foreign militaries worldwide, including Chechen insurgent forces, Turkish Special Forces, and the Republic of Korea Marines. He embedded with the U.S. Marines for the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and embedded again with the U.S. Army's 4-6 Infantry for the closure of the Al-Assad Air Base and the withdrawal of U.S. forces from the An Albar province, western Iraq, in December 2011. After 9/11, Billingsley was one of the first to cover the war in Afghanistan and was present at both the Kwali Jangi Fortress uprisings, which took the life of Johnny Michael Spann, the first U.S. combat casualty in Afghanistan. He was also in the Battle of the Shah-e-Khat Valley, known as Operation Anaconda. He's produced a wide variety of media from his fieldwork, including 2 books: Operation Anaconda, America's First Conventional Battle in Afghanistan, recently published by KU Press, and Fangs of the Lone Wolf, Chechen Tactics in the Russian-Chechen War, 1994 to 2009, recently published by the U.S. Army's Foreign Military Studies Office. In addition to that, he's produced and directed many documentary films and won both the prestigious Rory Peck and Royal Television Society Awards for Best Feature for his film House of War, and produced and directed 9 films for the Kennedy Center here under our series title Beyond the Border. These films include Helen Foster Snow, Witness to Revolution, Masses to Masses, An Artist in Mao's China, Chechnya, Separatism or Jihad, and Global Car. His current film in the series, which you may be familiar with, Unfortunate Brothers, Korea's Reunification Dilemma, examines the prospects of Korean reunification through the experience of North Korean defector living in Seoul. Billingsley is an avid collector of realism art and serves on the advisory board for Utah Valley University's Woodbury Art Museum, where an exhibit on his Soviet military and industrial art is currently showing. Is that true? That's gone. There was. I say that's ended. That's ended. That's right. Okay, where it was presented and it was wonderful. Yes, there is art, and it has been shown. He has lectured extensively at various universities and institutions and is a regular contributor to Jane's Defense Weekly and Jane's Intelligence Review. He received a BA in History from Columbia University and an MA in War Studies from King's College in London. We hope at some point soon that films like Unfortunate Brothers you'll be able to access online. But right now, there is a set of the films available in the Learning Resource Center in the library. So if you're interested in checking out those films, I'd also point you to Combat Films' website or Facebook page, where there's lots of really interesting clips, YouTube clips, and updates on the Korean film as well as the other films. Today's presentation, as I mentioned, South Korean Armed Forces Engage a Shifting Defense Paradigm. Please join me in welcoming Dodge Billingsley.
Welcome. Thanks for having me back. If you've heard my lectures before, you'll know that I am really interested and fascinated with things that relate to international security and global security, those kind of things. And I was struck by the prayer. He mentioned that we would learn things and put them to good use. And I thought about that since he said that, because I was like, what's the good use in a lecture like this? And what's the impact that we can have on anything about, and I really, maybe it just comes to one basic thing, and that's, I think, the more understanding we have on all parts of the world, all regions, all issues, we can then help make better informed decisions. And maybe no one in this room will be in that position to make an informed decision, but you can still have an influence, and I think still having a great understanding and knowledge. And it's one thing I love about the Kennedy Center is that it sort of is devoted to that and it's dedicated to those kind of things. So we're going to talk about the Korean Armed Forces. So why? Why do we talk about the Korean Armed Forces? Well, one, they are probably central ally in the region. You could argue Taiwan, but we have a large military presence, the United States still in Korea. Anybody know how many troops we still have in Korea? Roughly? 28,000. I think now it went down from 40. There's been some moves to, and this is one thing I don't know if anybody knows, who has, in case of war with North Korea, who has operational control? The South Korean Army or the U.S. forces? U.S. forces have operational control. South Korean Army, Navy, Air Force would tail, and Marines would tail into the U.S. OPCON. Now, that was set to change in 2009. The Koreans pushed it back. It was set to change in 2012, and now they're talking 2015, where the Koreans will take operational control of their own forces. But there's been a kind of a pushback. So what's going on in the region and what's going on on the peninsula in North and South Korea, I think really does matter. So to that end, let me just give you sort of a brief update of the Ministry of Defense. You have Kim Kwon-jin, who's the Minister of National Defense since November of 2010, and that's a significant, there were some events that happened around that time, which is why he becomes the defense minister. And you see a fairly robust military presence by number. You had 500,000 Army troops, 500,000 soldiers in the Army, which in fact, did you pay attention to the cuts proposed by our Secretary of Defense, Hagel, in the last couple of days? Our Army is supposed to go down to, I think, 440, is that right? I think it's supposed to go down from 480 to 440. They're going to bring it down below that. They had proposed 480, 490, and they're talking now 440, which is, that's a big cut. It's a really big cut, whether it's 480 or 440. But I mean, so the Korean Armed Forces, the Army itself will outnumber us. Traditionally, it's been like the Korean Armed Forces have taken a very sort of static defensive posture, which is for obvious reasons. They have hostile or semi-hostile, or some would say a non-hostile, but they have a rogue regime in North Korea right across the 38th parallel, or through the demilitarized zone, of which the capital of South Korea is within artillery range of that zone. So, but at the same time, they are really modernizing the armed forces. They've been out to do that. And so what I want to do is sort of give you sort of a brief history of how we got to where we are. As you know, Korea was occupied by Japan in that area during World War II, and afterwards, when MacArthur moves over to take more focus on Japan, they also work on the Korean military, and they basically come up with a constabulary force is the first force. And they started with the school of the English language military school, and it's interesting, the first 110 graduates of that school, it's fairly significant. I mean, you got 13 of the first 15 Republic of Korea commanders come from that, and 6 future defense ministers come from that original 110 sort of graduating class. And from that, it's a gradual buildup. The U.S. intensifies its efforts, and there's a kind of an unknown man in history named Captain Houseman for the Army, who is really significant in shaping Republic of Korea military doctrine, because he, as a captain, says we need to translate all of U.S. military doctrine into Korean. And so prior to that time, it wasn't this case, so you could teach by example, but now the Koreans could read traditional, U.S. military doctrine. So what do you get? You get a nation military shaped very much on our military. For better or worse, that's just the way it is. But I mean, without these initiatives by Captain Houseman, maybe this doesn't happen as fast. You can see the size grows dramatically from basically 13 months, you go from 6,000 to 31,000. And then by the time you have Korean statehood, you have a 50,000 strong constabulary force. The U.S. is committed to, 20 million, which, again, that's kind of hard to measure. What does that mean in 1948 dollars or whatever? But it's a lot of money for its time, but it's still probably not enough. And, we have 500 U.S. military advisors there. So again, this is a military that becomes shaped in our image, which I think is going to have implications. But Korea has its own history. There's a number of, there's the Yosu Rebellion, and it's basically a purge of the constabulary forces, and it said that they eliminated the leftists. So this was still an area sort of up for grabs post-World War II. There's conservatives, there's leftists, there's different types of people, the different types of Koreans in the constabulary force, but they're really moving toward a more conservative-dominated force. The Armed Forces Organizing Act, of course, basically just creates the Department of National Defense. And but by 49, you have 65,000 troops and 8 tactical divisions. But you don't think of a tactical division in the sense of a tactical division like in the United States would be 20,000. So obviously they don't have near enough. It's almost like brigade plus size, perhaps. The Korea War starts in June of 1950. And at that time, there's just shy of 100,000 Army, a small Coast Guard, even smaller Air Force, and you have a course of National Police. Again, so what? What's the point of all this? One is constabulary forces, when you think of them, they are used traditionally for internal security. So there's sort of a tradition established from the beginning. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing, because Korea basically after World War II is a country and a state that has to basically redefine itself in many ways. It's wedded to U.S. military doctrine, and the fact is when the Korea War starts, they realize, or it's realized, that whatever the force size was and the composition, it's just simply not enough. When I mentioned the $20 million that the U.S. gave the South Korean Army prior to the war, what was interesting is we were holding back on our most lethal elements. Like we didn't give them tanks, for instance. We gave them like 1,000 trucks and 10,000 jeeps. Well, that can move troops around, but a tank to put around downrange is much more effective in fighting a war. So we were giving aid, but it just wasn't necessarily war-fighting aid necessarily. There's been a number of reforms, this is recently, but there's a couple themes I think are really interesting. Korea, like every other nation in the world, wants to be self-reliant when it comes to the military, their defense, and the security of their country. So they are, the things that come out of the defense white paper are, which can reasonably assure peace and prosperity on the peninsula. We'll build a military force structure that best fits the characteristics of modern warfare. So they want to modernize, they want to fight as asymmetric threats, they want C4I, they want all the, new means of everything. They want to expand the civilian workforce and the Ministry of National Defense so the military can focus on combat missions. And they want to innovate defense management systems. But this is an interesting one. They want to improve barrack culture and overall national defense. And we're going to talk about barrack culture as we go on, because the reality in Korea is that they want to modernize and have the state-of-the-art weapon systems and to know how to use them, but it's based on a conscript army. And that is challenging to say the least. If you're rotating conscript soldiers out every 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years, depending on which branch of service and what their MOS is, what they're going to do, you really have a hard time training up to take on the technology of the most advanced weapon systems. And so you have some disconnects, and there's a lot of nations around the world that have this, but Korea has a very ambitious modernization program. Something's going to have to give as far as like how this is going to work with how they recruit and how they run the armed forces. So by 2020, it was decided that the government would increase defense spending dramatically, upgrade all the weapon systems, and again, they just wanted to, first off, in their threat doctrine was to take care of their most imminent threat, and that's the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or North Korea. But, and toward that end, they've reduced the number of troops. Again, they've hired civilians in the Ministry of Defense. They've reduced the number of troops. They've tried to increase officer rate. And again, but they've modernized military barracks. They've issued promotion systems based on merit. They really want to modernize the force, but it means somehow they've got to modernize how they construct the force when it comes to the human aspect of it. So this is an issue for them. One quote from the Defense White Paper: the ROK military needs to retaliate immediately and resolutely against enemy provocations. In the future, the ROK military will decisively strike not only the region of enemy provocation, but also the command and support forces behind the provocation. And if you remember, Park Geun-hye, when she was inaugurated and became president of South Korea this last year, there was, in the beginning, was it about a year ago now? Man, time flies, so it could have been 6 months ago, but there was a lot of very intense rhetoric between the North and the South. And South Korea basically said, if you attack us, we're not only going to attack you back, but we're going to take out command and control elements, i.e. Pyongyang, i.e. these centers of gravity for the North Korean military. And that's a huge escalation in rhetoric, at least. And you just don't know. Everyone says, you get different schools of thought. Some people say, oh, nothing's going to happen on the peninsula. And I swear, half the days of the week, that's what I think. And then the other half the days of the week, I think, wow, this thing could really blow up. I really don't know. Part of it's because North Korea is such a wild card. It's such an opaque regime. There's a rationale to everything they do, but do we necessarily know what it is? I don't know. I mean, there's a famous quote by one of the former CIA directors that says North Korea is the single greatest intelligence failure in U.S. history. And then I would probably agree with that, not knowing what our other failures might be. But, I mean, it's really hard to discern. We know we can count tanks, we can count ballistic missiles, we can count troop movements, but it's really, really difficult to measure intent and rationale. Two things changed in 2010, and I had mentioned that they had a new defense minister in 2010. The South Korean corvette, it's a ship, a medium-sized ship, the Cheonan, was sunk in March of 2010, just off the northern limit line, which is the sea coast to the west of the Korean peninsula. And then nearly 6-7 months later, or a little bit later, Yongpyong Island, or Waipido, as the U.S. Joint Forces call it, U.S. Force Command there, was shelled, artillery barrage by North Korean artillery. And the defense minister resigned. And if you look at the defense paper for 2011 and the defense paper for 2012 and what's being drafted for 2013, these two events have it casts a shadow over all South Korean defense thinking right now. I mean, there's always been provocations, hundreds and hundreds of provocations on the DMZ. The war ends in 1953. In fact, let me just get to that. Well, first off, based on these two events, there's three key priorities the white papers lay out. First is they want to have this immediate and retaliation posture against enemy provocations. I mentioned that briefly. They want to develop elite and combat-oriented military, and how to care for the misfits. This is also very interesting in the white papers, which are, I mean, they're like 300 pages long. This theme of misfits, this idea of conscripts, this idea of matching human talent with the weapon systems they want to have, it's a big issue. Korea is the only country in the world, I think, of the developed nations that it's illegal to be a conscientious objector. And during the Cold War, conscientious objectors have served up to 7 years in prison. Now, a standard military sentencing of, a standard prison sentence of 18 months is the norm for being a conscientious objector in South Korea. You just simply can't be one. If you are, you break the law and you go to jail for 18 months. That's probably, you know, in every country you're gonna have those who are pacifists for whatever reason, those who don't believe in the military, et cetera, but this hasn't changed in South Korea. And so you have all kinds of things where you have hazing. Hazing is terrible in the South Korean military. A lot of it isn't public, but every once in a while things start coming out, and then a little flood will open, and there'll be more and more cases. We think of hazing being really bad, for instance, in the Russian military, because we have more data on it, I think. But apparently it's bad, if not worse, in the South Korean military. And again, it comes from a system where there's like an officer caste system. You're conscripting your basic fighters. There's just a real disconnect between the lower levels and senior or middle-ranking and higher level officers. And this has implications for how you fight. There's no doubt about it. I mean, think about what the United States has done. We started the, Eric, what's the place you used to teach at Fort Bliss? Sergeant Major's Academy. Sergeant Major's Academy out at Fort Bliss. And it's not for us, it's for our foreign military allies to come and teach senior enlisted ranks how to run small units and how to interact with officers and just how to run that core of the Army, because if you don't have it, and everybody knows, like when I'm with the Marines, you know, you're with a platoon of Marines, you know, the captain is the company commander, he gives it to the lieutenant gives it to the first sergeant runs the platoon. He runs it for all practical purposes. Sometimes the lieutenant comes right out of West Point, he steps in, he's had no experience, which is not a bad thing, but that's just where he's been. He comes out, he graduates with a commission. It's the sergeant who runs the small unit. This is a really big challenge for the South Korean Army. Now, this isn't to say that if they were attacked by North Korea, they wouldn't rally. Of course, South Korea would rally, and you know, I think they'd take care of business. But if you want to modernize your force, bring your force structure down, your number of personnel down, you really have to think about the social aspects of a conscript army. And Korea's in the midst of that, right? South Korea's in the midst of that right now. So let's look at that. They have always trained for the traditional threat of North Korea. They fight the war. They also say, you know, some people say there was a second Korean War from 1966 to 1969 when the number of provocations between North and South along the border really grew. And there's some evidence that the North Koreans were really testing out and thinking and looking at what was happening to the United States in Vietnam and then trying those tactics on the Korean and maybe to put pressure on our ally in South Korea and on the DMZ. We also have, you know, like if you think of the axe murder incident in Operation Paul Bunyan, and you think of operational control. Does anybody know about the axe murder incident? Well, there's an observation point right there in the joint security area where the North and South Koreans will actually meet when they do face-to-face talks. And close to that, there's this like North Korean post and a South Korean post, and there's this tree. And the U.S. wanted to go cut this tree down. The North Koreans said, you can't cut, I'm giving you the short version, of course, but they want to cut the tree down. They say, no, you can't. We send a couple guys out there with our axe to cut down the tree. The North Koreans come out and kill our guys with the axe. Just bludgeon them, you know, cut them, you know, chop them up. So we install what we come up with Operation Paul Bunyan. Good name, right? We're going to cut down that tree anyway. But we mobilize an aircraft carrier. We fly B-52s overhead. We have close air support and fighters kind of like in orbit also. And we send a company, and we send guys with the South Korean commandos with suicide vests on as part of this mission to go out there to deter these North Koreans from coming over and engaging. I mean, it was a full-scale operation. And then we chopped down the tree, and we rolled it all up and left. That's kind of been the way these things, I mean, the DMZ is full of amazing stories. When we were working on the film, Unfortunate Brothers, we went out to the joint security area, and they had just captured, not captured, but there was a North Korean commando who would always go out on the lake with his boat and fish by hand grenade, and he'd collect the fish that were stunned, and he would always, though, drift across into the U.S. area, the U.S.-South Korea area, so we'd have to pick him up. Our SF guys would go pick him up, and he's about 5'1", and just really, wouldn't talk, really angry, and they detain him, and this is the third time they've captured this guy, and so they just, he was like, do you want it effect? No. Call the North Koreans up, we got your guy again, the fisherman. And so then they take him and they set up a little parlay and they turn the guy back over to them. I mean, it's a very strange area. And again, in the film we mentioned this, and I think probably most of you know it, when you say demilitarized zone, nothing could be further from the truth. It's probably the most heavily militarized border in the world. I don't know if I have that statistic. Oh yeah, here we go. 70% of the North Korean People's Army is south of Pyongyang-Wonsan line. In other words, 70% from our intel estimates, and maybe it's off by 10%, but basically put the whole army right on the border. 60% of their Navy is south of that line. So it's all forward deployed, and this has a long, long history. If you go back, and this is what's really interesting. I was teaching Walden High School students yesterday, and someone asked me the question, is war good? Is there ever such thing as a good war? I'm like, wow, that's a really complicated question. It's a really complicated question. But one of the things that's interesting to me about North-South relations in Korea, and again, as far as the U.S. having operational control, it's how we look at things and we don't talk. So we get to these elements or these periods of brinkmanship. Prior to 1955, 6, 7, the North Koreans had a massive land army. South Koreans didn't have the same size land army at all, and the U.S. wasn't committed to putting in the same size land army, which we considered a deterrent. And this is still right after the war. Maybe we thought maybe North Korea would attack again. So to offset or to equal out the size of the North Korean army, we introduced the atomic artillery to the region, and we placed 10 atomic cannons on the border in 1958. We see it as like, we can't match your million-man army or whatever it is, so we're just going to put these 10 nuclear, this nuclear deterrent right on the border. Well, the North Koreans didn't look at it as like an equalizer. They looked at it like, holy cow, man, now they're like going to challenge us with our nuclear artillery. So what do? They actually push their army all down south, because the idea was, what we think, they never said it, is if they push their army all down south, we're going to nuke positions that are just like 5, 10, 20 miles away. So that nuke, the fallout of that nuke strike is going to affect both the South Koreans and the U.S. on the DMZ as well. So that was their way of countering that. So this is a real interesting tit for tat that goes on and on. Again, I've given you a short version. You may want to look it up, but there's a lot of issues there to think about. One of the interesting things, too, that's going on right now is because the sinking of the Chonan and the shelling of Waipido, they've established a new Northwest Islands Defense Command. So think of that as a combatant command. Like we have CENTCOM, Central Command, AFRICOM, AFRICOmmand, PACCOM, PAC Command. The U.S. has divided the world into 9 combatant commands now with AFRICOM. And the combatant commander is in charge of any activity that goes on in that area. So we're more familiar in our nation with CENTCOM, because it seems like every war we fought and every threat we've engaged in the last 20, 30 years has been a CENTCOM, which is like Northern Africa, Middle East, Central Asia. PACCOM, Pacific Command, that's this region here. So they've established their command. And the Marines, this is the first time the Korean Marines have been given any command authority. They have a command for the first time. I was talking to aides to U.S. Forces Commander General Sharp, who recently retired. General Thurman's the U.S. Forces Korea Commander now. And we were in Fort Hood last month to see a battalion of 1st Cavalry troops off on a 7-month rotation to South Korea. And it's interesting, they were debating this Northwest Islands Defense Command. And one of the couple, of the senior level U.S. personnel there were saying this is a complete waste of time, frankly, to lose sleep over these islands. I mean, this is the boats, North Korean boats come across this area all the time. They follow the blue crab migrations down the coast. That's rarely mentioned. You just let the Koreans follow the blue crab, North Koreans follow the blue crab migrations, just monitor it and just let it go. Don't worry about it. But whatever. They've established this command. They've also given this authority, they've been given this authority to fire directly, because one of the issues with Yangpyeong Island, or Waipido, is that there was not an immediate response. And so that's why it was, South Koreans didn't think that was a very good reaction or a very good response. They also have an asymmetrical threat. The North Koreans, of course, they've tested. Eric Heyer and I were on the North Korean-China border on the 2009 test. The little earthquake, we thought it was an earthquake. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a test. It was 70 miles from the border. And they tested again in February 2013. Excuse me. They're probably not close to miniaturizing or weaponizing any sort of bomb or putting in a delivery system or delivery vehicle capable of a long strike, but we also know they're testing ballistic missiles. Most of them have gone down and, in great fanfare, not doing very well. But as a result, senior South Korean officials are openly talking about maybe it doesn't make sense to keep engaging the South Koreans, the North Koreans in diplomatic talks, because this is like a cyclical game that never leads us anywhere. Whether that's true or not, that's sort of what they're thinking. In fact, rather, they're arguing for a robust missile deterrent. They've expanded the range of their own missiles. They've changed the payloads on the UAVs, and they basically declared a doctrine of preventative strike if they feel like they're threatened with nuclear attack by North Korea. So this is interesting. In fact, just this week there's a report out as well from the South Korean government and from a couple of the other global agencies, because the North Koreans just started up, a few months ago, they started up that old 5 megawatt nuclear reactor just outside of Pyongyang with the old graphite rods, the kind that melted down in Chernobyl and the kind in 1957 that melted down and caused the fire in the UK. And there's a really big fear. In fact, the NBC teams, the nuclear, chemical, biological teams on the South Korean military, they're as much preparing to handle any sort of North Korean nuclear mishap as they are nuclear exchange or some sort of detonation. Because there's a real fear that this system could melt down, and the winds will blow it over Pyongyang and then north across China into Russia and across the Bering Strait, apparently. But this is a real fear. It's a very, very old Magnavox technology with graphite rods, and nobody uses this stuff anymore. But the North Koreans are desperate for energy, and so they've restarted it. So there's this sort of, even in their peaceful use of nuclear power, there's a threat level there that the Korean military, South Korean military, sees as their job to at least think about, if not deter and stop. Oh, they also set up a cyber command. Of course, who isn't? Everybody is, right? They also presuppose this sudden collapse, because if they get a gradual collapse of North Korea and it's all meted out in equally, fair time, then they can handle that. But if supposing they think that if it doesn't and if it goes down fast, the Korean military would probably be the only institution, the South Korean military, that is capable of really doing anything about it. A Council on Foreign Relations study recently said it'll take 460,000 military personnel from the South, from anywhere, I guess, to basically stabilize North Korea. Now, it's just one study from Council on Foreign Relations, but there's a lot of these studies, and there's a lot of things to do. They want to secure the border with China and Russia. They want to round up the sensitive military facilities and peaceful nuclear facilities as well. They want to guard the infrastructure. They need to provide health care, foodstuffs. Again, only the Army's probably the only element or the only entity in South Korea that can really do this. And then they have to establish a provisional government, and then they would probably have to engage in a guerrilla or insurgent fight against what we call former regime elements. If Pyongyang collapses, there's no reason to believe or to think that everybody there is going to happily just fold into South Korea, because these people who have been in power in North Korea, they will instantly be out of power. They have the weapons, and what we saw, again, from our own experience in Iraq, once we disbanded the Ba'ath Party and the army, which was a Ba'athist army, that started the insurrection. And the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency people I used to work with, used to always refer to them as former regime elements. I know in the media it's like, oh, we're fighting Al-Qaeda. Not necessarily true. Basically, we fought former regime elements because they didn't have anything else to do and anywhere else to go, and they knew where all the weapons were. And that's probably be a good scenario, or a good planning scenario for the North Korea, if a North Korean collapse occurred as well. So the military sees their mission in South Korea as huge, which perhaps is one reason why they probably don't want to put up with people like conscientious objectors. This is like a matter of national security for them. It's interesting. There's always food fights between the services. Here we have food fights between the Air Force, Marines, Army, and Navy. It's over budget. In South Korea, the Army has always dominated the thinking and the budget and the strategy because the most immediate threat has always been North Korea, which has a huge standing army 30 miles from Seoul, 30 to 40 miles from Seoul. So the Army gets most of it. So there's been efforts at interoperability, but mainly it just adds to frustration from the Air Force and the Marines and the Navy, and they don't have the best interoperability. But they've looked at us, they've watched NATO, they've watched the Chinese try to work with this, and again, it's part of the modernization campaign that South Korea is trying to engage in to be more effective in the future with less. Really, these modernization ideas from the human capital point are to do more with less. They've ramped up defense spending, and their key, this whole thing, again, they wanted to be independent defense. The only way to really pay for that is to have a robust defense export business. And so from 2006 to 2011 or 2012, they've upped defense exports by over 40%. Now they're a competitor for the global arms market. And so that's kind of been a big thing. You can see these tanks here. One is ours and one is theirs. Can you tell the difference? Do you know which one is ours and which one's South Korea, which one's the US? Ours is the bottom one? Okay, yeah, you can tell a little bit. It's basically, though, I'm not gonna say a carbon copy, but it's made very much like ours. However, it fits the South Korean security paradigm. It's 8 to 9 tons lighter. It's got a hydrodynamic suspension, so it's good in the mountains. It's better in the mountains. They found out early on with our M1A1s and M1A2s that it wasn't the best mountain terrain tank. And the Koreans basically modified, and shrunk theirs down so it's lighter, more agile, and it's got a different, so it works better for what they think they're going to do. But this is actually interesting. There's also been, for the first time, I've seen it publicly in the last couple of years, people at the DoD and the Defense Acquisitions and Procurement and with our allies, that department, and there's some consternation with the South Koreans because basically it looks like basically they take a look at they take our car or our tank around the block, kick the tires, say, yeah, that was a nice ride, and 2 years later they roll out with a mini version of their own. And they're doing that. There's a real fear of that now, even with the Advanced Joint Strike Fighter is up in this discussion as well. And then when the U.S. officials were pressed to comment on this, we don't comment on these sensitive issues with our allies, but there is some tension there between South Korea and the United States because of, it's almost this, they just re-engineer the vehicle or whatever it may be, and then pretty soon they put it out on their own, and then they sell it on a global market, which, as crass as this may sound, we sell our weapons on a global market too, and this is basically competition. But you have to understand it also from the defense. I'm not justifying what's going on necessarily, but if you look at defense acquisition, it takes very, very long lead times. You don't just dream up the Joint Strike Fighter and put it out in 12 to 14 months. It's more like 12 to 14 years or maybe 24 years. Did it say we need it? I don't know. I'm not going to go down the moral lane on this thing, but just to say that you'll have to have ways to offset this. If you look at our own Joint Strike Fighter, we're trying to sell that thing to like 36 partner nations to help defray the cost. These things are huge in R&D costs, long development time, and you need to try to share this. The Koreans have been very aggressive at marketing their product abroad, and now I think they are the number 8. I can't remember. I think they're the number 8th largest global arms exporter. It's in the top 10. I don't know exactly on that one. So the Army, I don't want to go too much into flow charts again. They're down to around 500,000 men. In given time, let me just advance ahead. Again, the Army is the most dominant. They really want to just modernize. They want to become a net-centric Army. They want to have all the new 21st century weapons. They feel like they still have the big threat from the north, but they're also thinking and looking more and more at different threats in the region now. And again, they have a conscription-based military, which kind of hinders it a little bit. Their basic mission is to deter, if the size and the power of the South Korean, you got to remember, the military's first role is to do what? Deter. Military's first role isn't usually to fight, it's usually to deter. By a strong military, the thinking goes, you deter other adversaries from engaging you in a military conflict. If deterrence fails, the first 3 missions, according to the Defense White Paper, defend Seoul. I mean, you got to think about this. They're 30 miles off the DMZ. There's 100,000 North Korean artillery tubes that could rain down at least 100,000 rounds on Seoul. We may take them out in the next couple of minutes. When I say we, the U.S. Joint Forces, U.S. Joint Korea and U.S. Forces. But that's still a lot of rounds that are going to hit Seoul, which is the capital of South Korea. And I think, what is Seoul? Is it 20 million people? How much? Is it? Oh, it's only 12? All right, smaller. But there's a lot of people there. I mean, and it's a major target. Obviously, they wanted to then destroy the North Korean army and weaken its continued will to fight. That's the mission. Again, and this is according to their own white paper, and they really are aware of professionalism in the ranks is a big, big deal. And but they're going ahead. They're trying to build up the NCO, again, the non-commissioned officers, the senior enlisted. They're integrating more females into the women into the army, and they're really trying to shrink the gulf between soldiers and the other ranks. And this is really important. I mean, you've really got an army that really needs to overcome some of the social barriers in Korea that exist in Korea. It's just the way Korea is socially. And again, weak leadership at the company and platoon level. There's 3 field armies. They're being reorganized as well. There's the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd armies. And the 1st Army has the eastern part of the border. Right here. The 2nd Army is kind of like an operational command, and it's in the rear areas, so it takes responsibility for basically this area. And the 3rd Army here is basically takes the whole western 2/3, and 3 of the 4 North Korean invasion routes during the Korean War, they have responsibility for those 3 routes. So they have a different kit. They have a different sort of, if you look at Korean armies, let's see, I think the Korean 1st is more less mechanized than the other one. It's really based on terrain and where they think that threat from North Korea will come. So they're well established. And again, the doctrine has been, since '53, to protect against a major invasion from the north or these small-scale incursions that the North Koreans could do by special forces. The Air Force, this is really interesting. It's small, but they're really modernizing, and they're building up a lot of different capabilities. They're looking to acquire advanced fighter program and move on with the next generation fighter. And as I said, there's been some consternation with the U.S. as to how deep to go into the technology sharing of the advanced joint strike fighter and some of our other Air Force assets. They are selling weapons. I think there's a Korean order to Iraq, Korean medium attack aircraft to Iraq recently, the KA-1s. Transport planes, they have a few C-130s and a bunch of 235s, which means, and this is an interesting thing, that they're building up this, and then the Navy, and we'll look at this in a minute, is that they're establishing their ability to project power. The benefit of being an ally to the United States is that we have always provided the power projection. When you think of the British War in the Falklands, and you think of all kinds of different engagements with our allies, or our allies undertook, it's U.S. force projection that facilitates and allows that to happen. With the carrier strike group, we can put enough power off the coast of almost any place in the world to really get down to business if we have to. And the Air Force assets, the long-range capabilities, we have this capability which a lot of countries don't and rely, our allies, on us. Korea is building themselves out of this reliance on the U.S. They want to have their own Air Force assets. They want to have their own naval assets. They want to be able to take care of their own territorial sovereignty. And a lot of this has been, at least in the press, exacerbated by the air defense identification zone that China threw up a few months ago, and then the Koreans followed suit with their own air defense zone. And so basically, you see that this area is, and we talk about it all the time, is being contested. It's definitely being contested, and you can see this in the development of the military capability in the region and the doctrine accompanying. Now, technology should follow doctrine. Technology shouldn't drive doctrine. But you can see they're making a play to stake out territorial claims, and we're going to get to a couple of those. I mean, they have Takashima Island, if you're Japanese, or Dokdo Island right here. It's a matter of national pride, and the Koreans have sworn to defend it. The Japanese claim it as theirs. The Koreans claim it as theirs. They are also building, let me get to the Navy page. Oh, this is the same map. Let's see. But South Korea is basically in the point of building 3 big bases right now. Jeju, and over here. And what the idea is that these three major bases, what it looks like is they're just sort of ringing South Korea, and yes, they can attack or fight the North or hold off an attack, but they're also putting a footprint out into this area. So if they have issues with Japan or China or whatever, it's changing. The Dokdo class here, these amphibious carriers, they have a couple. They want to build 6. So when you think of the military lift and the ability to project power, I mean, on a U.S. Aircraft carrier like the Bonhomme Richard, the U.S. Marine Corps the Navy's amphibious carrier that the Marines are on, it carries a squadron of helicopters, attack helicopters, and 1,200 Marines, and it's a pretty good amphibious force. But it's just, you put 6 of them in, and it's really changing. And so I've read a lot about how the South Korean defense budget mirrors the Brazilian defense budget, and we shouldn't really worry about it because it's kind of the same. It's a certain percent of GDP. But what I look at is not those macro levels. I look at this macro analysis. I like to look at what capability you're getting. If you can move basically a battalion and a half or 2 battalions on an amphibious carrier with all the combat power that an amphibious carrier has, and you times that times 6 if they really do build all these carriers, then you've just really increased your power projection capability for the region, which means you could go out and you could land 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 on a number of contested islands, which these are the points of conflict for Korea outside of the North Korean conflict. Not, it's just an expanding military. It's just expanding area. Again, the Marines, they have their own region. They have their own combatant command now, first time ever. In this area here, there's the northern limit line, and this area is contested by the North Koreans and the South Koreans. But after the shelling of the sinking of the Cheonan and the shelling of Waipido, the artillery shelling of that island in 2010, they established a new command with release authority to counter, to attack any provocation by the North Korean. Now, what that means, and we don't have all the actual, classified data on to how great an extent can you retaliate, but they have retaliation orders. They can do that right away. So they've changed a lot of things there, and we think there's a lot of, but again, there's lots of issues going there. Listening to some of the U.S. force commanders talk about this, I was a little bit surprised because I thought we'd really be for defending this, and they are for defending it. But what was interesting is not against temporary incursions. Again, you got to understand. And he said one of the big things is they always see a flood of North Korean boats during the blue crab migrations that go south, and we just need to just realize that when they go down a certain level, then they just come right back across. Are they technically in South Korean water? According to South Korea, yes. But is it something to be alarmed about? We don't know. Do we need to conduct military activities or military maneuvers right up against the northern limit line? Maybe we do, maybe we don't. I don't know. Those are just things that, this is a very hotly contested area of the Korean border, which is hard to sort of get a grip on. It's not a land mass, it's just an area defined by a line in the sea, with a few islands carved out. But it's intriguing. Again, I want to wrap up because I know that we need to go, but if there's any questions, I'd love to hear it. Conscription, they conscript, 300,000 a year? Every year you had about 1,000 that refuse and go to jail for 18 months. Hazing is big. Suicide is fairly significant. And in the wake of and in the midst of all those sort of negative things, they're admitting more females, which it's going to be an issue. I mean, whether I'm not trying to pick a side. It's just going to be an issue for better or for worse. So they have some things to sort out. And again, let me just say before closing, it's not to say that South Korea, their army doesn't work. It's not going to work. It's not huge. It's a very robust army. If you look at their fighting, like in Vietnam, et cetera, alongside us, they're very, very capable, very dedicated. But there's a disconnect a bit between the younger generations and the older generations. I mean, in our film, it was one of the more revealing facets of the aspects of the film is how much disconnected. I mean, we went to see DJ Soulscape, and he's a very famous DJ in South Korea in a Studio 360, and he had 7 guys working for him in his little posse there, he called them, and 4 of them had just got out of the army within the last month, because they went on their conscription, and they were like, I don't know how I felt about shooting targets that a target that, what am I trying to say? A target made out to be a North Korean. They felt uncomfortable with that. They don't have a war experience. They weren't around the 1950s. They weren't around the 1960s, or they weren't even born in 1970s during the Paul Bunyan incident, perhaps. They just feel disconnected. They think that this war with North Korea is just pie in the sky. This will never happen. It's just like whatever. You know, they have their way, we have our way. We don't know, but it's a challenge for the Army, especially as they rely on a conscription army. Let me end there. I know time is short. Thank you very much for your attention. And like I say, if there's any question, I'd love to hear it.
You may have to run out to your class, but if you'd like to ask a question, we'll just take 5 minutes. And please line up at the microphone on the side. Tell us your name and what you're studying, and we'll just take a few minutes. So if you have any questions, now's your chance. You gotta leave it there. We're recording. You have to come over there. Gotta come over.
Thanks, Dodge. That was fascinating. I was intrigued by one of the notes that there's a deficit of career and commissioned officers, non-commissioned officers. What is your sense for? I mean, it surprised me because I thought culturally Koreans would be inclined to revere the military and see it as a social status prestige thing to be an officer in the military, much like Americans from the South or something like that. But is there did you ever in your interviews find that there's a problem with young people just simply not seeing the military as a career, as a prestigious career? Is it that, or is it that the economic opportunities outside the military are still so attractive that they just think they don't want to be an officer because there's alternatives? And I guess maybe you could put that in context. The United States really doesn't have that problem, do we?
Well, to start from the back forward, the U.S. doesn't have a conscription-based army. It's a volunteer force. And there's been a number of studies in the U.S. military. If you look at the U.S. military, a lot of the rank-and-file soldiers come from medium to poor, poor to medium, the demographic here in the country. And the military is a way out, perhaps, or to sidestep maybe poverty. Doesn't mean they don't want to be in the military, don't revere the nation, et cetera, but it's also a social and economic way up. You know, I can't say that any one of what you said was right or wrong. I mean, we definitely talked to a youth who definitely believed that they had way more opportunity outside the military. You have a disconnect from when they felt like the military. See, the military is funny because the military in Korea is technically on a continual war footing. Then they see themselves, in fact, that's interesting. We have different states of alert. The Koreans do too. They feel that they are always on alert. It's just a difference of what that alert status might be. So, but the youth are just too disconnected from that. And the other thing I thought was interesting is patrolling the DMZ with the Iraq Marines. You know, they're talking to me about, let's be Facebook friends and, you know, email me. And they're just really connected to their world and the outside world. And I think the military, I can't say, you know, for sure, but it just seems like it might feel like it's an old system. Not for everybody. But like Katyushas, there's an institution within the Korean military called the Katyusha program, where these are the Korean liaison soldiers to U.S. forces. So speaking English is a prerequisite, but they have a much better life while they're in the service. They have higher pay, they have better barracks, they usually, you know, can live with the U.S. troops. It's much different than just a rank and file combat infantry guy. And so, and that's very coveted, and everybody wants to be in that program because if you're gonna have to be in the military, you might as well be in that kind of thing. So I just think I don't know. I think all of those things could be right. You know, and it's interesting to me. I mean, at some point, because of the sort of state of alert and war footing that Korea sees themselves on, I can understand the conscription-based army, but what they really are going to probably have to do, but maybe they'll never, I don't know. They'd be better off probably with a professional force if they think they could generate enough interest to run a professional force. But that's, you know, I don't know. Because if you get a professional force, you're going to stay in for longer. I mean, the conscription base, they've kept lowering the requirements. I'm going to get this wrong, but is it 14 months, Danny? Do you know? For the Army, I think it's 14 months. Yeah, for every branch of service, it's a bit different. Army, which is the basic, here's your rifle, learn how to shoot it, point, shoot. They have the lowest sort of technical requirement. Theirs, I think, is down to 14. The Air Force and Navy, it's longer. So they're not really in there long enough to really do anything, and they probably are getting hazed, and there may be this and that, and they're like, this is ridiculous, I'm out of here. So it's kind of a tough, because if anybody has a threat, I would say South Korea lives in a threatened space. but they have a population that the younger they go is more and more disconnected. I don't know if that's a good answer, but yeah.
I'm Conrad Davis, studying political science. You talked about how South Korea is trying to modernize its military. Do we know a lot about what North Korea is trying to do? Are they trying to do the same thing with new technology and new structures?
That's a great question. North Korea is absolutely trying to modernize their military, but unfortunately they just buy old MiG-19s from Cuba and try to ship them to the Panama Canal. This is the issue with South and North Korea. If you look on paper, the North Korean army would be obliterated if it was a paper war with South Korea. It's not even close. I mean, it's just like one century fighting the other century. They're scraping together parts and stuff, but because since the Soviet and the Cold War collapse and the end of sort of beneficial trade policies, there hasn't been a steady stream of Soviet or communist bloc era weapons into North Korea, or food for that matter, which is why one of the reasons they have such severe starving in the country. So there's no way on paper they could ever stand up to the South. I think it'd be a very short war, but think of short wars. I mean, in Iraq, we seized Baghdad in 20 days, and then the insurgency started. So I think on paper we would eliminate as much of the big assets the North Koreans had very quickly, but then the insurgency starts because you're just still disenfranchising 3 million elites, and the army is that part of that elite in North Korea that they don't have anything else to do or anything else to go. So they could put up a very, very, I would say, dedicated insurgency in a terrain that is really friendly to insurgent warfare. It's not flat. It's mountainous. It's a very easy terrain to just escape and get lost in, et cetera, et cetera. So but they are trying to modernize. Back to your original question, it's just that they just don't even have the levers to pull to modernize, and no one's going to sell them modern weapons because of the sanctions, et cetera, et cetera. The Chinese, there's more and more evidence all the time, Eric, you would know of the Chinese being just completely annoyed with the North Koreans. It's like the bastard child they can't control, is they just can't do anything with, it's like, what's going on here? So they don't have a lot of options to really modernize, or else they wouldn't be starting up their 5 megawatt Magnavox, graphite reactor again. So good question though.
Hi, I'm Jordan Roud. I'm studying Asian Studies, and I'm also in the U.S. Marine Corps.
Oh, cool.
So
Semper Fi.
I've had just what little insight I've had in Dr. Heyer's question. I've never met any Korean military members that weren't shocked that I was in the military and that I would join voluntarily. And they were like, if you've had the choice, why would you not just go to college and better your life? So I haven't had a lot of experience seeing them viewing officers as a prestigious career. My question is more towards South Korea's defense preparations for China taking over North Korea in the case of North Korea collapse. Is that talked about? Is that prepared for? And maybe if you could talk about that issue.
Obviously there's a lot of stuff that's, I'm sure, talked about and prepared for that's all classified. I have no idea. But that is a major concern, is what happens to North Korea. The Koreans will tell you Korea is for Koreans, and it's going to be theirs no matter what. And I think, I don't know. My guess, if it was at the moment, China would want to secure that border and make sure that they don't get their stream of all the million refugees causing problems in that area. But I don't know if China would move deep into Korea or not. I mean, I think there'd be some high-level communications between the United States and the Chinese so that they would be assured that we're not there to seize North Korea, but I don't know. I think it could happen, so the scenario could unfold in so many different ways. But nobody wants to go to war with China, on this issue, but I don't think China wants to go to war with anybody over North Korea. I mean, I just can't imagine. But I do think they want their border to be secure. I do think every country has an interest in that. And Eric, you're writing a book on borders in China, right? I mean, they care about this stuff, but I don't know. That's a very good question. But I know so little about what the North is thinking. It goes back to our problems with navigating the North, is that you just have a really incredibly hard time knowing what's going on. I mean, there was an excitement when Kim Jong-un, came to power because it was change. Because you don't know what you're going to get with change. Now it just looks like more of the same, maybe worse. But we didn't know at the time, You just never know. That's a good question.
Any final questions? If not, we'll wrap this up. Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks a lot, you guys. Thanks for saying.